The morning light spilled across my workbench in the Asheville studio, catching the edges of the unfinished bracelet I had been soldering. I had just set down the torch when the phone rang. The name on the screen made me hesitate. Vera? She rarely called me directly. And when she did, it was never for anything good. I answered anyway. Her voice was bubbling with excitement. Breathless the way someone sounds when they can't wait to flaunt a secret. Greer, she said, stretching my name like it was a performance. I just got back from Zurich. Oh. You should have seen the shops, the dinners, the mountains. I loved spending your $80,000 on my luxurious trip. For a moment, I simply listened, the words hanging in the air like smoke. 80,000, my 80,000, she claimed. I steadied my breath, let her continue rambling about boutique hotels near Lake Lucerne and how the maitre d' at some restaurant treated her like royalty. I murmured polite acknowledgement, the way you would to a stranger on the bus who insists on telling you their life story. I didn't let on that my pulse had quickened. Not from anger, but from confusion. $80,000. I had never stored that kind of money at home or anywhere outside the credit union. Tilda, my bookkeeper and closest advisor, had drilled that habit into me years ago. Cash belonged in the bank, logged and traceable. Vera laughed on the other end, savoring her own story, until she finally signed off with a satisfied sigh. Anyway, just thought you'd like to know what your money bought. Memories. Beautiful memories. The line went dead before I could form a reply. Silence pressed against the studio walls. I turned back to the workbench, but my hands refused the steadiness required for fine metalwork. Minutes later, a courier knocked. I signed mechanically, slid open the envelope, and froze. Inside were receipts. Swiss receipts bearing my name. Purchases at jewelry boutiques in Zurich, hotel folios in Lucerne, all tied to transactions I had never authorized. The numbers on the slips blurred before my eyes. They weren't mine. They couldn't be. And yet they had found their way to me, addressed without error, like a warning placed neatly on my desk. I set the envelope aside, already reaching for the ledger drawer where I kept every account record, knowing I had to confirm what Vera thought she had touched. I opened the old oak drawer in my studio, the one where I kept my loupe, polishing cloths, and packets of solder, tools, not treasures. The brass handle stuck as it always did, reminding me of how many years I'd worked this same bench. Vera's words rang in my ears. I found it in a drawer. She made it sound as if I'd carelessly left stacks of bills sitting among the pliers and files. That thought dragged me backward through time, after my husband's sudden death. When Keir was still a boy, I learned the hard way what carelessness with money could cost. I sold bracelets at weekend fairs near the Biltmore gates, squinting under tents, praying the tourists would find my work worth the asking price. Some weeks, all I carried home was enough for groceries and the light bill. Other weeks, when luck turned, I deposited every dollar at the credit union on Charlotte Street before sundown. I never trusted myself to leave cash lying around, not even overnight. Tilda reinforced that discipline when she came into my life years later, first as a neighbor, then as a friend, eventually as the bookkeeper who helped turn my side craft into a business. Money is no safer in a drawer than bread is in the sun, she told me once. I took it to heart. Since then, no more than a couple hundred ever sat under my roof in loose bills. And yet Vera was convinced she had stumbled on 80,000 of mine. Her certainty clung to me, unsettling and sharp. She had spoken with the easy arrogance of someone who believed she'd earned the right to take what wasn't hers. I ran my fingers over the small set of files lined neatly inside the drawer. Each one had a purpose, each one in its place. The same could be said of my finances. There was no hidden stash waiting to be plundered. Whatever Vera touched, it wasn't mine. I closed the drawer and stood in the quiet, my mind already moving toward Keir, wondering what role he might have played in this tangled mess. In Asheville, appearances carried as much weight as craft. A necklace might sparkle under gallery lights, but if I showed up in wrinkled clothes or missed the wine reception afterward, doors closed quietly, without explanation. Over the years, I learned that a dinner at the Grove Park Inn, a glass raised at a River Arts District opening, or a handshake in Biltmore Village was as much part of my work as hammering silver. I never confused those obligations with indulgence. They were the currency of reputation, and without them, my studio would have remained a booth at weekend fairs. Vera never understood that distinction. She called it all play acting. More than once she smirked when I mentioned a client dinner, another luxury night out. "Must be nice," she'd say, her tone sharpening just enough to make it sting. She saw the wine, the restaurants, the clothes I wore to events, but she didn't see the contracts that followed or the gallery placements secured, because someone remembered how seriously I treated my own presentation. For a brief stretch, Keir thought it might help Vera to feel included. He gave her a company card with a modest limit, hoping she might handle small expenses. Flowers for the booth, shipping supplies, maybe a dress for a reception if she attended with him. It didn't last long. Within weeks, she'd charged handbags and spa services, arguing that clients expected her to look polished if she was going to represent the family brand. Keir shut down the card and paid the balance himself. Embarrassed by her carelessness, the resentment only grew from there. Vera began treating every new contract or exhibition as proof that I was sitting on a pile of money while keeping her at arm's length. She accused me once, outright, of hoarding wealth. "You hide it all in your accounts while I make do," she hissed, as though the years of late nights and careful ledgers had been handed to me by chance. Her envy hung around us like humidity, seeping into every conversation. It didn't matter how often I explained that every gown I wore and every dinner I attended came from the necessity of sustaining the business. To her, it was proof that I was living well while she was denied. I began to wonder what her bitterness might drive her to claim next, and that thought returned me to Keir, who carried more than he ever admitted. The call came from Zurich on a Tuesday morning, a distributor I had courted for years finally ready to feature my designs. They wanted a capsule collection displayed in their city showroom, a chance to place Asheville-made jewelry among European buyers. It was the kind of opportunity most artisans only dreamed of, and at 62, I knew how rare it was to receive such an invitation. Keir was elated. We mapped out the logistics in the studio shipments, customs paperwork, time zones, and I felt a new energy crackle between us. For all the years of careful growth, this was a leap forward. Then Vera inserted herself. She overheard us one evening and declared, as though it were already settled, that she would accompany us. Zurich, finally, a proper life. I should be there too, part of the brand. Her eyes glowed with anticipation, the kind that had little to do with contracts and everything to do with boutiques on Bahnhofstrasse. I told her plainly this was business, not leisure. Keir backed me, firm for once, explaining that we needed focus, not distraction. Vera scoffed, accused us of wanting to leave her behind while we lived like aristocrats. In the end, Keir offered a compromise, one that still makes my stomach tighten when I recall it. "We'll buy you a vacation," he said. "Flights and hotel. 1 week, but the rest is up to you." His voice carried the tone of someone desperate to keep peace, even at a cost. Vera seized on the offer without hesitation. Within days, she had her itinerary 10 days split between Zurich and Lucerne, spa reservations already booked. She left brimming with triumph, snapping photos in the airport lounge before her plane even departed. I tried to push her antics aside, focusing instead on preparing the collection. Yet when she called weeks later, fresh from her return, it wasn't the usual envy-soaked jab. It was a boast. You wouldn't believe it. Greer. I found 80,000 ready to use. Just sitting there, waiting. You never told me you had it tucked away. The detail that chilled me wasn't the number. It was the place she mentioned. Not my home, not my studio. The Alden townhouse, Kier's old residence. Still in his name. Long closed off to her. Her words settled in me like a stone. What drawer had she opened there? And what else had she pulled into the light? The receipts lay across my work table like a shuffled deck, each slip bearing numbers I didn't recognize. I studied the last 4 digits on every line, steadying my breath the way I would before setting a stone. They weren't tied to my accounts at the credit union. They belonged elsewhere. That evening, Kier came by, shoulders drawn as though he carried the weight of a season's losses. I slid the receipts toward him without a word. His eyes moved across the paper, and I watched the color drain from his face. "Mom," he began, voice low, "I need to tell you something." He sat, elbows on his knees, unable to look at me at first. 6 weeks earlier, after Vera maxed out yet another card, he had decided to act on his own. He withdrew $80,000 from his personal savings, not from the studio. He emphasized, never from the studio. He intended to clear Vera's consumer debts directly, off the books, to keep our ledgers clean for the Zurich deal. He wanted to shield me. Shield the business from the mess she had created. I thought if I paid it all in one sweep, we could move forward without the collectors breathing down our necks, he said. His hands clenched as if he could still hold the cash. So I put it in the locked drawer at the old townhouse. I hadn't had time to settle everything yet. The picture sharpened all at once. Vera's triumphant call, her claim of finding a drawer of money, the receipts that didn't match my accounts. It all pointed back to that decision. She had raided what was never meant for her indulgence, turning a lifeline into a passport for extravagance. Kier finally met my eyes. Shame plain in his expression. She spent it, didn't she? I nodded, the weight of his secret now shared between us. The drawer he meant to use as a rescue had become the very place she chose to sink us deeper, and I knew this was only the beginning of what we'd have to face. Tilda came over the next morning, her leather-bound ledger tucked under one arm. She had the calmness of someone who had seen every manner of financial mess, yet I noticed the crease deepen between her brows as she read through the receipts. With her reading glasses perched low, she traced each line, tapping the digits with her pencil. "These deposits didn't go into a bank," she said. "They were loaded into a travel wallet, some fintech account Vera set up to look seamless abroad. Zurich, Lucerne, even Zermatt. Every charge ties back to her name." The certainty of it hit like a hammer blow. This wasn't confusion or a mistaken swipe of the wrong card. She had taken cash that wasn't hers and laundered it into vacations and handbags. And because the funds came from Kier's personal account, not the business, there was no shielding it as a family misunderstanding. Legally, it was theft. Kier stood in the corner, silent until he couldn't hold back. "I should have known she'd do this," he muttered. "I thought I was buying us peace. Instead, I gave her a weapon." Later that afternoon, Vera called again, her voice loud enough through the speaker that both Tilda and I could hear her defiance. "Don't make it dramatic. Greer, I've earned that money. Who do you think has been promoting your jewelry online all these years? My time, my posts, my friends seeing your work. It's worth something. I just took what I deserved." My hands trembled, but my voice didn't. "You took what wasn't yours. That's not earning, Vera. That's stealing." She laughed, a brittle sound. then hung up when Keir told her he was blocking her number. The room was still, except for the steady scratch of Tilda's pencil as she drafted what she called the last offer. A boundary letter. Clear, precise, impossible to twist. Either Vera returned the funds on a repayment plan, or we would file a police report. I signed my name at the bottom, each stroke firmer than the last. Tilda folded the letter into an envelope and set it on the table. Her expression, solemn. Keir stared at the envelope for a long moment before sliding it closer to him, as though bracing for the storm it would unleash. Within 2 weeks of sending the boundary letter, word reached us through neighbors' collectors had begun circling Vera's sublet off Tunnel Road. Notices were taped to her door, and men in cheap suits waited by her steps. One afternoon she called from a new number, her voice sharp with accusation. "You did this, Greer. If you hadn't made such a fuss, none of them would be after me. Family is supposed to cover family. Instead, you've sabotaged me." I listened without interrupting, because I'd learned interruption only fed her. When she paused, I spoke evenly. "The collectors aren't here because of me. They're here because of what you borrowed and never paid." She hung up, but the words lingered like smoke in the room. Later that night, Keir came by, worn and restless. He sank into the chair by my workbench and finally let the truth spill. "I didn't tell you how bad it was. Mom. She wasn't just behind on one card, there were 3, plus a consolidation loan she never mentioned. I thought if I could wipe it all at once, we could hide the mess and keep going." He pressed his palms together, ashamed. "I didn't want you to think I'd tied myself to someone so reckless." I placed a hand over his. Steady. Hiding it didn't protect me. "Keir, it only delayed what had to come out." He nodded, shoulders sagging. "She wants a meeting, a mediator at the legal clinic. Maybe she'll face it if it's in writing." I agreed, not because I held hope she would change, but because boundaries meant showing up and saying the truth out loud. If she refused again, at least there would be no room for denial. By the end of the evening, the appointment was set. I returned to my bench, the bracelet still waiting, and felt the weight of years pressing down years of saving, working, and refusing shortcuts. Now tested by someone who thought drawers existed to be emptied. The clinic meeting would bring us all into the same room, and I knew there was no hiding left for anyone. The legal clinic sat in a modest brick building on Charlotte Street, its waiting room lined with pamphlets about mediation, debt relief, and tenant rights. Keir and I arrived early, Tilda already seated with her portfolio balanced neatly on her lap. She had come prepared, every receipt and ledger page clipped in order. When Vera walked in, she carried herself as if she were the only one inconvenienced by the gathering. Her hair was perfectly styled, her coat far too fine for someone under siege from creditors. She barely looked at me as she sat across the table. The mediator began with introductions, outlining the process. "We're here to seek resolution," she said. "That requires honesty on both sides." Vera leaned back, arms folded. "There's no dishonesty here. I simply used money that was available. If they didn't want me to touch it, they shouldn't have left it lying around." Tilda opened her folder with a slow precision. She slid forward copies of the cashier's check, the withdrawal slip from Keir's account, and the receipts from Zurich. This wasn't household money, Vera. It wasn't spare. It was designated to pay your creditors. Nothing more. The mediator scanned the documents, then looked squarely at Vera. "Mrs. DeLark, using those funds for personal travel instead of debt settlement could be interpreted as misappropriation. If pursued, this may rise to criminal theft." For the first time, Vera's posture faltered, her lips parted, then tightened again, indignation fighting with unease. "You're exaggerating," she snapped. "Keir owes me. I've stood by him, supported his family business, promoted them online. That has value. Kier's voice was quiet, but firm. I'll give you one last chance. If you admit in writing what happened and surrender the luxury goods you bought, I'll help negotiate with the creditors. We can still avoid the worst of it. The offer hung in the air like a lifeline, but Vera shoved it aside with a bitter laugh. I won't sign anything. You're trying to trap me. She stood abruptly, chair legs screeching against the floor, and stormed out before anyone could stop her. The door slammed behind her, and the silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Tilda closed her folder, her eyes on me, and I knew we had reached the edge of what could be offered. Weeks after the mediation, the paperwork came through. Creditors had won their judgment. Vera's lease was terminated, and within days she was gone from the Tunnel Road sublet. Word reached us through acquaintances that she had moved into a one-bedroom walk-up near Merriman Avenue, the kind of modest space she once mocked as beneath her. There was no gloating in it for me. I had seen too many people learn too late that consequences aren't negotiable. Still, I couldn't ignore the bitter taste of relief that the constant calls and threats had shifted from our doorstep to hers. Meanwhile, the Zurich collection arrived safely and was unveiled in the distributor's showroom with Matteo's careful coordination. Orders followed almost immediately. Galleries that had once hesitated now reached out, and the studio's reputation carried across the Atlantic. Kier and I worked long hours, but it was the kind of labor that built rather than broke. For the first time in months, the ledger showed not only stability, but growth. On a cool afternoon, I drove up the Blue Ridge Parkway to Craggy Gardens, a place where the air always seemed clearer. Standing at the overlook, I let myself feel the weight of it all. At 62, I was too old to bankroll ruin. I had survived the lean years, built something from tents and fairs, and refused to let someone else's recklessness consume what I had spent decades shaping. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Vera. Just one line. You ruined me. I read it twice. Then opened the folder where Tilda had kept our drafts. I sent back a copy of the boundary letter and, beneath it, links to debt counseling services in the county. Nothing more, nothing less. It was all that remained to offer. Kier came by later, still carrying the shadow of guilt. I handed him the phone so he could see her words and my reply. He nodded slowly. No argument left in him, only quiet acceptance. Outside, the mountains dimmed into blue, and I felt something loosen in me. The boundaries we had set were not cruel. They were the only way forward. And now, with the Zurich contract secured, the studio had a future worth protecting, one that no drawer full of cash could ever buy.